The British torches illuminated the night sky as the White House burned before my eyes. In that moment, I feared our young republic might perish, a republic I had spent my life constructing. People by James Madison, illuminating history's architects of liberty. At this pivotal moment in our republic's journey, we face a most curious paradox. The man who perhaps contributed more to our system of government than any other remains, peculiarly, among the least celebrated of our founding generation. I am James Madison, and today I shall reveal how a sickly, diminutive scholar of 5 feet 4 inches became the architect of American liberty and the 4th president of these United States. By the conclusion of our discourse, you shall understand not merely the mechanisms of our Constitution, but how its principles might preserve your freedoms in this modern age. As you observe in this portrait, I was not blessed with Washington's commanding presence nor charisma, yet the system of government I designed continues to shield your liberties centuries hence. Let us examine how this came to pass. I entered this world on March 16, 1751, at Belle Grove Plantation in Port Conway, Virginia, born to wealthy landowners James Madison and Nellie Conway Madison. Unlike many of my contemporaries, I was plagued by frail health from earliest childhood, seizures, fevers, and a constitution so delicate my family frequently feared I would not survive to adulthood. Yet what providence in physical robustness, it compensated with intellectual vigor. By age 12, I had commenced intensive study of Latin, Greek, mathematics, and modern languages under the tutelage of whom I would later credit as having given the first spring to my mind. My formal education culminated at the College of New Jersey, what you now know as Princeton University, where I completed a 4-year course of study in merely 2 years, immersing myself in the works of and the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers. These thinkers would profoundly shape my understanding of human nature and governance. Consider this curious fact. I devoted myself so intensely to my studies that I allowed myself but 3 hours of sleep nightly for months on end, permanently damaging my already fragile health. Such was my commitment to intellectual development, a sacrifice I made willingly, though it would plague me with chronic exhaustion throughout my life. If you find value in these historical insights that remain relevant to your liberty today, consider supporting this channel with a subscription. Each week, we examine the ideas that built America and how they continue to safeguard your rights in the modern era. Now, I must reveal something few comprehend about my early political development. While history remembers me as the father of the Constitution, I initially harbored grave concerns about the concentration of power in any central government. This apparent contradiction requires explanation, for it illuminates the careful balance I sought to achieve. Let me pose this question to pique your curiosity. How did a man initially skeptical of centralized authority become the architect of our federal government? The answer lies in a profound intellectual transformation that occurred during the critical period following our revolution. A transformation I shall reveal after we examine the crisis that necessitated a new constitutional framework. By 1786, our young nation teetered on the precipice of dissolution. The Articles of Confederation, our first attempt at national governance, had proven woefully inadequate. State governments issued their own currencies, erected trade barriers against one another, and refused to honor their financial obligations. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, where desperate farmers rose up against crushing taxation, the disorder threatening our republic. I documented these defects meticulously, producing a memorandum titled Vices of the Political System of the United States that would serve as the intellectual foundation for constitutional reform. The crisis was more severe than most citizens today realize. Foreign powers awaited our collapse, creditors lost faith in our promises, and the revolutionary spirit that had united 13 colonies threatened to fracture into regional interests. This was the crucible in which my political philosophy was forged. I concluded that a stronger central government was not merely desirable, but essential for the preservation of liberty itself. A paradoxical realization that liberty required sufficient governmental power to secure it. Let me share a personal recollection that illuminates this period. During a particularly contentious session of the Virginia legislature, I witnessed a colleague propose a special tax to support Christian teachers. Though raised in the Anglican tradition myself, I found this proposition alarmingly inconsistent with true religious liberty. This experience crystallized my conviction that majority factions, unchecked, could threaten individual rights as surely as any monarch. The solution to this dilemma would emerge through intense study and correspondence with Thomas, then serving as minister to France. Sent crates of books on ancient and modern confederacies, which I devoured in preparation for what would become the most consequential political convention in American history. Now, before we proceed to Philadelphia and the Constitutional Convention itself, let us consider an intriguing question. How might one design a government strong enough to function effectively, yet sufficiently restrained to preserve liberty? This fundamental tension has defined American politics from my era to yours, and the solution I proposed contained an ingenious mechanism that continues to protect your rights today. On May 14, 1787, delegates from 12 states assembled in Philadelphia. Though officially convened to amend the Articles of Confederation, many of us, myself included, recognized the necessity of more radical reform. I arrived with a comprehensive plan already formulated, having reached the convention well before most delegates to prepare. Meticulously, at age 36, I was considerably younger than many delegates, yet I spoke more than 200 times during the proceedings. My preparation was exhaustive. I took detailed notes of virtually every speech and debate, providing the most comprehensive record of the convention's deliberations. Each evening, while others socialized or rested, I meticulously transcribed the day's proceedings, preserving them for posterity. What became known as the Virginia Plan, which I largely authored, established the framework for our deliberations. It proposed a strong national government with 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, and a bicameral legislature with representation based on population. This represented a fundamental departure from the Articles of Confederation, where each state held equal influence regardless of size. The ensuing debates were often contentious. The smaller states, fearing domination by their larger neighbors, vigorously opposed proportional representation. The deadlock threatened to collapse the convention entirely until the Connecticut Compromise established our present system: proportional representation in the House of Representatives and equal representation in the Senate. Yet perhaps my most significant contribution was the system of checks and balances that permeates our constitutional structure. Drawing upon its principle of separated powers, I engineered a government where ambition would counteract ambition, where the natural human tendency toward power accumulation would be harnessed as a mechanism for restraint. As I wrote in Federalist No. 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. This recognition of human nature's duality, our capacity for both reason and passion, altruism and self-interest, informed the Constitution's elaborate system of institutional restraints. Consider this remarkable fact. The Constitutional Convention might have established a parliamentary system similar to Britain's, where executive power derives from the legislature. Instead, we created a presidency with independent authority, capable of checking legislative overreach. This innovation has proven instrumental in preventing the tyranny of legislative majorities that plagued ancient democracies. Now, as we approach the critical question of ratification, I must address a surprising development that few anticipated. My collaboration with a man whose political vision would later diverge dramatically from my own, Alexander Hamilton. The Constitution, once drafted and signed, faced a perilous path to ratification. 9 of 13 states needed to approve the document, and opposition was formidable. Anti-federalists raised alarming concerns about centralized power, absence of explicit rights protections, and the potential for governmental tyranny. To secure ratification, particularly in the crucial state of New York, I joined forces with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay to produce what became known as the Federalist Papers' 85 essays explaining and defending the Constitution's principles. I authored 29 of these essays, including the most celebrated expositions of constitutional theory. In Federalist No. 10, I addressed perhaps the most pressing concern in any democratic system, the problem of faction. Earlier democracies had collapsed when majority factions oppressed minorities, yet I proposed a novel solution. Rather than attempting to eliminate factions, which would require destroying liberty itself, we should control their effects through a large republic with numerous competing interests. This counterintuitive argument challenged conventional wisdom. Previous political theorists, including, had insisted republics could survive only in small territories with homogeneous populations. I demonstrated that America's vast size and diversity were not liabilities, but assets in preserving liberty. The multiplicity of interests would prevent any single faction from dominating others. Let me share a personal reflection that few historians have noted. During the ratification debates, I found myself arguing alongside men like Hamilton for a stronger national government, despite my natural inclination toward restraint of power. This tension between my philosophical caution and practical recognition of governmental necessity would define my political career, and indeed, the American political tradition itself. The ratification struggle proved arduous. In Virginia, my home state, Henry delivered impassioned orations against the Constitution, warning that it would destroy state sovereignty and individual liberty. For 3 weeks, I debated Henry and other anti-federalists, ultimately securing Virginia's approval by a narrow margin of 89 to 79. Yet the price of ratification became increasingly clear, a promise to amend the Constitution with explicit protections for individual rights. Though I initially resisted this demand, arguing that enumerated powers rendered specific prohibitions unnecessary, I would soon become the champion of what you now revere as the Bill of Rights. But before we examine that critical development, let us consider a profound question that resonates through American history. Can a constitution created for an agrarian 18th century society adequately govern a modern industrial, or in your case, technological nation? The answer lies in understanding not merely the specific provisions I helped draft, but the underlying principles they embody. Upon the Constitution's ratification, I sought election to the first Congress, defeating future President James Monroe for a House seat. Though I had initially opposed a Bill of Rights as unnecessary and potentially dangerous, fearing that enumerating certain rights might imply that unlisted rights were unprotected, I now recognized its political necessity and philosophical value. On June 8, 1789, I introduced 19 amendments to the Constitution, drawn from state ratification conventions and existing state constitutions. After congressional debate and revision, 12 amendments were submitted to the states, with 10 ultimately. In 1791, these amendments, protecting speech, religion, assembly, and due process, among other rights, have proven among my most enduring legacies. The First Amendment's prohibition against religious establishment deserves particular attention. My early experiences in Virginia, where dissenting Baptists suffered persecution from the established Anglican Church, convinced me that genuine religious liberty required governmental neutrality. As I argued in my Memorial and Remonstrance against Religious Assessments in 1785, the religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. Consider how revolutionary this principle was in human history. Throughout civilization, governments had aligned themselves with particular religious traditions, often persecuting dissenters. The American innovation, separating religious and governmental authority, created unprecedented freedom of conscience while simultaneously protecting religion from political corruption. If these insights into constitutional design and the protection of fundamental rights are valuable to you, I encourage you to support this educational endeavor with a subscription. Your engagement allows us to continue exploring the ideas that secure liberty in each generation. During my congressional tenure, I also opposed Hamilton's financial program, particularly the establishment of a national bank, which I considered unconstitutional. This marked the beginning of a significant philosophical divergence between us, one that would ultimately produce America's first political parties and shape the nation's development for decades to come. My opposition to Hamilton stemmed not from personal animosity, but principled concern about expansive constitutional interpretation. While Hamilton advocated implied powers beyond those explicitly enumerated, I warned that such elasticity might eventually render constitutional limitations meaningless. This tension between strict and loose construction of constitutional powers continues to animate American jurisprudence in your era. This fundamental disagreement with my former Federalist Papers collaborator raises an intriguing historical question. How did the author of the Constitution evolve into a leader of the Democratic-Republican opposition to Federalist policies? The answer reveals much about the complex balance I sought between effective governance and limited power, a balance that would be severely tested during my presidential administration. After serving as Secretary of State for 8 years, I ascended to the presidency in 1809, inheriting diplomatic crises that would ultimately lead to America's first declared war under the Constitution. The European conflict between Britain and France had placed our young nation in a precarious position, with both powers violating American neutral rights at sea. British impressment of American sailors, essentially kidnapping our citizens and forcing them into naval service, represented an intolerable affront to national sovereignty. After diplomatic efforts failed, economic coercion through trade restrictions proved ineffective, and British-incited Native American hostilities on the frontier increased. I reluctantly requested a declaration of war on June 1, 1812. I must acknowledge a painful truth. The nation was woefully unprepared for this conflict. Our military establishment had been deliberately kept small during its administration, reflecting Republican concerns about standing armies. The Treasury contained insufficient funds, and the Bank of the United States, which might have facilitated war financing, had been allowed to expire the previous year. Let me share a personal recollection that illustrates the gravity of this period. When Congress narrowly approved the war declaration, with all New England representatives opposed, I experienced profound anxiety about the nation's division. That night, I confided to Dolley my fear that sectional differences might destroy the union we had so carefully constructed. Her reassurance proved invaluable to my resolve during the difficult years ahead. The war's early phases brought humiliation. An invasion of Canada failed disastrously. Our Navy, though achieving some remarkable victories, could not break British naval supremacy, and Native American allies of Britain threatened Western settlements. The nadir came in August 1814, when British forces invaded Washington and set fire to the White House and Capitol. Few Americans today fully appreciate the personal trauma of that event. As president, I had ridden out to observe the American defensive position at, nearly being captured when our forces retreated. Dolley famously secured Gilbert Stuart's portrait of Washington before fleeing the presidential mansion. That evening, watching from across the Potomac as the symbols of our government burned, I confronted the possibility that our constitutional experiment might not survive. Yet from these ashes, a renewed American spirit emerged. The successful defense of Baltimore, immortalized in Francis Keyes' Star-Spangled Banner, and Jackson's decisive victory at New Orleans transformed the national narrative from humiliation to triumph. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, essentially restored pre-war conditions without addressing the original causes of conflict. This raises a provocative question. Was the War of 1812 a necessity for American national development or a preventable folly? The answer reveals much about the challenges of applying constitutional principles to international relations, a domain where power often supersedes law. The war's conclusion ushered in what historians would later call the era of good feelings, characterized by diminished partisan rancor and surging nationalism. During my second term, I embraced policies I had previously opposed, including chartering the Second Bank of the United States and supporting internal improvements. This evolution reflected my pragmatic recognition that effective governance sometimes required flexibility in applying constitutional principles. Perhaps most surprisingly, I endorsed a moderate protective tariff in 1816, departing from traditional Republican free trade principles. This shift acknowledged the wartime growth of American manufacturing and the strategic importance of economic self-sufficiency. My administration thus witnessed the emergence of a distinctly American economic system, neither purely Hamiltonian nor Jeffersonian, but a practical synthesis responding to national circumstances. My retirement from the presidency in 1817 did not end my public service. I remained engaged in national affairs, particularly through my rectorship of the University of Virginia, which and I established as a monument to Enlightenment principles and Republican education. The university embodied our conviction that self-government required an educated citizenry capable of reasoned deliberation. During my retirement years at Montpelier, I also confronted America's most profound moral contradiction: slavery. Though I recognized slavery's incompatibility with natural rights principles, I failed to transcend the economic and social constraints of my Virginia plantation society. Unlike Washington, I did not free my enslaved workers upon my death. Inconsistency that reveals the gap between my intellectual ideals and personal practice. Let me share a reflection that illuminates this painful contradiction. In correspondence with acquaintances, I acknowledged slavery as a dreadful calamity, yet argued that immediate emancipation without colonization would produce greater evils. This rationalization, common among the founding generation, exemplifies how self-interest can compromise even the most enlightened principles. My failure to resolve this contradiction represents my most significant moral shortcoming, one that would contribute to the national crisis culminating in Civil War decades after my passing. In my final years, I grew increasingly concerned about sectional tensions threatening the Union. My last significant public statement advice to my country, in 1834, implored Americans to cherish the Union as the palladium of your political safety and prosperity. I departed this life on June 28, 1836, the last surviving framer of the Constitution I had done so much to create. This raises a profound question for your consideration. How should we evaluate historical figures whose philosophical principles sometimes exceeded their personal practices? The answer requires nuanced judgment rather than simplistic condemnation or uncritical celebration. My most enduring legacy lies in the constitutional system that continues to govern the American Republic nearly 2 centuries after my passing. The fundamental principles I advocated, federalism, separated powers, checks and balances, and protected rights, have demonstrated remarkable durability despite dramatic social, economic, and technological transformations. Consider how the constitutional framework has adapted to challenges I could scarcely have imagined. Industrial Revolution, Civil War, World Wars, economic depression, civil rights movements, and the digital age. While specific applications have evolved, the underlying mechanisms for balancing power and protecting liberty remain essentially as I designed them. The system of judicial review, which I did not explicitly incorporate into the Constitution, but anticipated in Federalist No. 78, has proven particularly significant. The Supreme Court's power to invalidate unconstitutional legislation, established in v. Madison during his presidency, provides a crucial check against majority overreach, protecting minority rights even when politically unpopular. Federalism, the division of authority between national and state governments, has likewise proven adaptable to changing circumstances. While the balance has shifted toward greater federal authority than I might have preferred, the underlying principle of divided sovereignty continues to prevent dangerous concentration of power while allowing for necessary national action. Let me share a personal observation that connects my era to yours. During my lifetime, I witnessed how factious spirit could threaten Republican government, with partisans often prioritizing victory over principle. In Federalist No. 10, I warned that the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man, a recognition that democracy's greatest threat often comes not from external enemies, but internal division. This danger appears no less prevalent in your time. The constitutional remedies I proposed, an extended republic with numerous competing interests and institutional checks against majority tyranny, remain essential safeguards. Yet these structural protections require supplementation by civic virtue and reasoned deliberation among citizens, qualities that seem increasingly scarce in your era of instantaneous communication and political polarization. The Bill of Rights, which I initially resisted but ultimately championed, has proven perhaps my most significant contribution to American liberty. These amendments have protected unpopular speech, minority religious practices, and procedural rights for the accused, often against substantial majoritarian pressure. Their importance has only grown as American society has become more diverse and complex. As we approach the conclusion of our discourse, I must pose this essential question. Can constitutional democracy survive without the civic education and deliberative habits that sustain it? The answer lies not merely in preserving institutional forms, but cultivating the Republican spirit that animates them. We have traversed a remarkable journey through the life and legacy of the Constitution's primary architect. From my early intellectual development through the Constitutional Convention, the ratification struggle, congressional service, and presidential challenges, we have examined how theoretical principles confronted practical realities in the construction of American government. Several vital lessons emerge from this examination. First, constitutional design requires balancing competing values: liberty and order, energy and restraint, majority rule and minority rights. The American system succeeds not by eliminating these tensions, but institutionalizing them through separated powers and federalism. Second, constitutional principles must adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning core commitments. My own evolution from strict constructionist to pragmatic nationalist during my presidency demonstrates how responsible governance sometimes requires flexibility in application while maintaining fundamental principles. Third, even the most carefully designed institutions require virtuous citizens to function properly. As I wrote in Federalist Number 55, as there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government depends upon this balance, neither naively trusting nor cynically dismissing human capacity for self-rule. If you have found value in this exploration of constitutional principles and their continuing relevance, I encourage you to support our ongoing educational mission with your subscription. By joining our community of thoughtful citizens, you contribute to the cultivation of civic knowledge essential to Republican government. I invite you to share in the comments your thoughts on this crucial question. How might we better balance the competing demands of majority rule and minority rights in our contemporary political discourse? Your reflections contribute to the reasoned deliberation upon which constitutional democracy depends. For those seeking deeper understanding of the founding period's complex political dynamics, I recommend our forthcoming examination. James Madison versus Alexander Hamilton, the untold power struggle that shaped America. This exploration will reveal how philosophical differences between constitutional collaborators evolved into political rivalry, with lasting consequences for American development. As I contemplated in my final public statement, the American Union represents the palladium of your political safety and prosperity. Its preservation requires not merely institutional maintenance, but renewed commitment to the principles of liberty, equality, and deliberative self-government that inspired its creation. May Providence grant that the constitutional system I helped establish continues to secure the blessings of liberty to you and your posterity. I am James Madison, and I thank you for your thoughtful attention to these reflections on our shared constitutional heritage.